Good evening. Thank you all for joining us for tonight's webinar. My name is Max Gorman, NIF Australia's Director of Programming. We are pleased to host this webinar with NIF's international leadership at such a crucial moment in Israel and for all of us here in the diaspora. This is a crucial moment. Last week, you would have seen an email from our new Executive Director, Michael Chadow, reiterating the importance of this very moment. It's inspiring to see Israelis on the streets standing up for democracy. And it's why we're ramping up our fundraising efforts, ensuring that we have the capacity to support all of those fighting for the important values of equality, justice, and democracy. That capacity can only come with your donations and your support. We are here to continue to fund the crucial work of Israelis on the ground, pursuing a society rooted in those values of justice, equality, and democracy. You will see a QR code to my side. You can scan that to lead to our donation page, because the time is now. With Pesach upon us in the coming days, continue to reflect upon this upcoming conversation and this moment in Israel, particularly the pursuit of freedom, such a crucial part of our Seder. Thank you for joining us tonight. I'm now going to pass it over to Libby. On behalf of NIF Australia, Chag Pesach Sameach.
We have had a pretty massive influx of new people joining New Israel Fund on all kinds of channels and in all kinds of ways over these last months. I wish it was under better circumstances, but we are finding that our pro-democracy message, pro-equality message of the last 43 years seems to be resonating with many new people in a new way at this moment. And so we're welcoming all of you new people. And this is a good chance for you to get to know our top leadership and some of our perspectives on what's going on. And for all of our existing supporters who we love and cherish so much from all around the country to have a chance to actually ask some questions that are really on your mind. So I'm going to try to keep our opening remarks fairly condensed, so that we have ample time to try to get through as many questions as we possibly can today, because it is a unique opportunity among friends and with our top leadership to just be able to unpack the things that are most troubling or most curious and on your minds, whether it's from the news or other aspects of what's been going on the ground there and here. And so with that, I'm going to actually formally introduce our speakers, though I know that some of us have known each other for many years and decades. There are also some new people. So without further ado, Rachel Liel spent a decade as New Israel Fund's executive director in Israel. Prior to her appointment, Rachel served as director of Shatil, the New Israel Fund's Initiative for Social Change, which provides training and consultancy services for the NGO sector in Israel. Before that, Rachel had a long and distinguished career in public service, having served as a deputy director of the Division of Rehabilitation Services in the Labor and Social Affairs Ministry, and as a policy analyst in the Department of Social Policy Planning of the Prime Minister's Office. Rachel has been publicly recognized for her outstanding leadership. She's been named one of 7 Israelis who influenced the greater good, one of the 40 Israeli women making the most significant contributions to Israeli society, and one of Israel's 50 most influential leaders, and one of the 101 people who have influenced Israel for the better by the Marker and Globes. Welcome, Rachel. Daniel Sokech has served as the CEO of New Israel Fund since 2009. During the past decade of extraordinary challenges, NIF has risen to new heights as the great defender of justice, democracy, and equality in Israel. Before joining NIF, Daniel served as the CEO of the Jewish Community Federation of San Francisco, the Peninsula, Marin, and Sonoma counties. Prior to his tenure at the Federation, he was founding executive director of the Progressive Jewish Alliance, now Ben the Ark. In recognition of his leadership, Daniel has been named multiple times to the Forward newspaper's Forward 50, an annual list of the 50 leading Jewish decision makers and opinion shapers. He's contributed articles to the leading newspapers and magazines. He is the author of Can We Talk About Israel? A Guide for the Curious, Confused, and Conflicted, which was released by Bloomsbury in 2021. Welcome, Daniel. Mickey Gitson is the director of New Israel Fund in Israel. Prior to joining NIF, Mickey was the founding director of Israel Chofshit, Be Free Israel, a leading grassroots organization fighting for separation of religion and state in Israel. Before that, Mickey was the spokesperson for MK Ilan Gilon of the Meretz Party and the associate director of Festival Beshekel, an organization advancing arts and culture in Israel's geographic and socioeconomic periphery. After completing his military service as an intelligence officer, he served as a shaliach emissary in South Bend, Indiana, for the Jewish Agency for Israel. Welcome, Mickey. And I am Livy Linkinski. I'm Vice President for Public Engagement at New Israel Fund, where I lead all aspects of NIF's public efforts in the United States, which is why you recognize me. I do a lot of webinars, communications, digital programs, events, leadership, community partnerships, New Gen and our fellowships, etc. Before I joined, I don't know why I'm reading this, I know this one. Before joining NIF, I lived and worked in Israel in the nonprofit field, in the human rights field for almost a decade, where I was at ACRI and a whole bunch of other NIF grantees. So welcome also to me. And I'm gonna start off with a kind of broad question for us. I'm going to ask two questions that we're all going to answer, and then I'm going to open it up for questions from all of you. To ask a question, there's a Q&A button in the bottom of your Zoom screen. So, don't wait. If you've got a question, you can throw it in there, and I'll be taking a look and incorporating your questions into our conversation the whole time. But first, I'm going to start us off with a question about the moment. It's been a very noisy, sometimes confusing, very action-filled few months, few weeks, and even few days. And I think I want to start us off by just focusing on both what are we seeing as the greatest threat right now, given that the judicial coup that was at the heart of these last few months and all of what we've been dealing with proposed by the Netanyahu government, that coup has been delayed. And so in trying to understand where we're at, I want to ask both, what do we think are the biggest threats right now? And also, what aspects of the massive movement of opposition to the government that we saw rising up in Israel over these last months, what moment or aspect of that is sticking with us that we think has real potential as we go forward into the coming set of things that may happen? And I think I'll start with Rachel on this one.
Okay. Hi, good evening, good morning, everybody. I'm very excited to be here. It's my first appearance as the new president of the New Israel Fund. I can't believe it, actually. Look, if you ask Israelis, most Israelis, what is the biggest threat? My guess is that you'll get the answer that it's the unity of the people of Israel, that we are torn, that we are divided, and it's not the same people. It's two camps that hate each other. But if you ask me, I have a different question. My feeling is that if the right wing, this extremist messianic coalition will succeed, what we will have here, the product of that success, will be something that for me will be unable to live with. I will not be able to identify with my beloved Moledet, with my beloved country. It won't be the same Israel if they will succeed. And it won't be the place that I would like my children to live. It won't be the place that I would like my grandchildren to live. It's simply, it's the democracy of Israel. It's so much in my DNA, in the way I was brought up with my parents, that if this is going to change, it will not be my country in a way, in the deepest, most emotional way. Now, the chances for that are not slim. We should not be eluded by the fact that there is, we managed to bring Netanyahu to say, okay, we take a pause, we delay. The right wing is quite strong in Israel. They have the majority. They won the election in a democratic way. So it can happen. And the pose, to my analysis, I will not get to it now, but doesn't do our camp good. It helps Netanyahu more than it helps us. So I'm concerned that it can still happen. Also, but even if not, and even if I'm taking the scenario that we will be able to stop this legislation and the judiciary aspects, we know by now that this is not just about the legal system in Israel. It's about the entire way this country is being built, the foundation, the principles, the values. So even if we succeed in the legal front, let's say, which I'm not sure we will, but I hope so, and this is why you have my red shirt of the demonstration that I go every week with my children and grandchildren and everybody. But even if we manage to do this, which will be a huge achievement in itself, I'm still concerned, and it's a threat for me, that we will miss the opportunity to do a change in Israel. It's not that it's like one of the actors in Israel said, I feel as if I have a lover and he left me and now I want him to come back. I don't want to come back to exactly where we are. First of all, I think it's impossible philosophically and practically, but also I want to use this opportunity to make a better Israel, Israel without a nation state law, Israel with equality, Israel with shared society between Jews and Arab. And I'm afraid that we will miss, if we don't act, we'll do the right things the way we missed, in my mind, most of the achievement of the 2011 demonstration for social justice back then. So that's about the threat, Libby. I know you gave me 3 minutes. Now, as for what's going on in the protest and how, first of all, what can I tell you, my beloved brothers and sisters? It's something I could never imagine will happen ever, and definitely not in my lifetime, to see hundreds and thousands in the streets demonstrating democracy. I think, first of all, the biggest achievement of this protest is to make this equation that being a good Israel is fighting for democracy. Being patriot is fighting for democracy. It's the good people who fight for democracy. I was also immensely impressed with the fact that for so many weeks we managed to create a protest that overall, whatever you call it, which is non-violent. It's just unbelievable, week after week with hundreds of thousands of people. And maybe the third aspect is that we managed to create a decentralized system of leading this demonstration. There are over 100 organizations who participate. You don't hear about people, you don't hear about ego fights. It's just run. They know how to manage it, so it belongs to everybody, except, unfortunately, and this is the big problem, not enough the Israeli Arabs. But I'll stop here and let you continue.
I know I only gave you 3 minutes. Now everyone knows. I want to give you 1 more minute, though, to tell us a bit about your t-shirt. You mentioned your red t-shirt from the protest.
Okay.
Just tell us what it is.
So my t-shirt, you see it now. As we said, we know already that it's not just about the judicial reform, et cetera, et cetera. So one of the groups that are really being threatened in a very deep way is the women. Because if we are going to have an halachic state, and with all the declaration of some of those crazy right-wingers leaders, women felt that they have to fight, especially on women's right, on women's equality. So the most impressive demonstration was Margaret Atwood, a handmaid protest. I don't know if you saw it, which was hundreds of women dressed as handmaids in this series, saying like, you are making us to be actually slaves again. You are depriving us of our rights. You are talking about gender segregation. You are talking about women going back to home and raising family and not having a career. We will not agree to this. And women become a very strong voice in the demonstration. And part of it is that we all women, and also my husband, in order to identify with me, bought a t-shirt. We all wear red, and this is our sign of saying, we women, we are strong, and we are not going to let you take us back hundreds of years. We are proud of our achievement, and we will continue fighting.
Thank you for the explanation, and thanks for doing that on behalf of all of us, women and men. Mickey, how about you?
Hi everyone, I'm very excited to be here, and I think the issue, what's the threat? I think the threat is as horrible as it can be. I think that we need to think about what's the goal of the people of this specific government when they lead this judicial reform, but not only. Their goal is basically to create an ultra-religious apartheid state that allows legally inequality between different groups in society, mainly between Jews and Arabs, all over from the river to the sea. That's the goal. Inequality is in the basis of the mission of this government. There is always the discussion about what does it mean Jewish and democratic, and actually the notion of Jewish and democratic broke completely with the nation state law. There are people that thought it's the nation state of the Jewish people that ensures equality to all of its citizens. And apparently, there is a big chunk of Israeli society that thought of Jewish as democratic as first Jewish and then democratic, or democracy for Jews. And it doubles down when you think about, of course, the reality in the occupied territories, because the goal there, clearly announced by parts of the government, is actually to create a one-state reality in which Jews have full rights and Palestinians don't. So that's the real threat. Everything that we see around it, including the legal reform, is the path together. And sometimes we're locked into discussion about the instruments, but not the goal. We have to be very clear on the vision. And the vision is what threatens all of us. And it touches, of course, Palestinians and women and LGBT people and others. But at the end of the day, their vision is one state, which is an apartheid state, based on the notion of Jewish superiority and inequality between people. And here comes, of course, the other side of the equation. So what actually makes me feel extremely optimistic at this day? We just had a study tour of American folks, who part of them probably on this call. And when we started the discussion, I felt that my colleagues from the US were much more pessimistic than us on the ground. And after we went, we canceled the first day and we took them to the main demonstration in Jerusalem, I think they kind of they drank the Kool-Aid. Like they understood why we became so optimistic through this really amazing struggle. Because you are seeing here a rebirth or redefinition of a political camp in Israel. It's broader than the protest itself. It's really a rebirth of a political, civically, but political camp, which is from the center to the left, that has weaknesses, but the notion on understanding and lack of fear is something that we haven't seen in decades. We will speak on other issues as well, but we are used to the fact that the moment the right wing is attacking us for our values, we basically back up. Not us, NIF, but our colleagues. And it doesn't happen these days. Really, people are standing for their values, and this is incredible. And this will have implications for the future and how we raise our children. And last point, which it's a bit cheesy, but I have to share. I sent it along this group. So after what happened with the firing of Gallant, my daughter was 3, went to their kindergarten. They sent us pictures and videos from kindergarten, and they were screaming "Demokratia!" They're 3, right? So the concept of kids in the age of 3 screaming "Demokratia" at gun at their school was just something incredible that, none of the people here in this room at least could ever imagine, because democracy was always seemed to be so complicated, so unappealing as a message. And here we are in Israel of 2023 with a huge threat, but also with quite impressive opposition movement that I really think it's a rebirth of certain kinds of Israel that we were expecting for many years.
Thank you, Mickey. I relate to your story about Ilyana. My nieces, as you know, who live in Tel Aviv, not far from you, also kept calling me after they were participating with their schools in the protest, and they sort of atmospherically know that I'm connected to that in some way. So the little one, we did a Yom Shibush Bagan, we did a disruption day in the gun. Like, tell me what that means. She starts explaining what disruption is. Daniel, what about you? What are your takeaways, both in terms of the threat and some moments of opposition from these last weeks and months?
Yeah, well, let me just also say that when Mickey sent me that picture of the Gan, what he didn't say was, he said, "Look who's leading them," and it was his daughter, of course, leading the chant, as we would all expect. And on that note, I just want to say, I want to give a shout out to Mickey and his team, and to Rachel and the Israeli board members and lay leaders of the NIF. We're working around the clock, as I think you all know, and Libby and I, as we have done in the past during crises in Israel and crises beyond Israel, are working. We're working ourselves. We're working around the clock, but nothing like what's happening in Israel, where our team is not only working on NIF's response to what's happening, right? Not only working on the emergency grants and on the other things that we're building, but also then, as Rachel said, when they clock out of a long day, they get themselves over to the protests. So I just want to acknowledge the extraordinary passion and dedication of our people in Israel. It's really breathtaking. Look, going third means that people have said many of the things that I think, and so I want to endorse what both of my colleagues have said about both sides of the equation, and maybe I'll just quickly focus on, when it comes to what I'm concerned about, what the threat is, something that both of my friends referred to, and I'll be a little bit more specific, and that is, right, like, what we know is that this is not about a particular legislative agenda. It's not about a judicial reform. It's about an attempt to change the character of the state of Israel into something that is worse than an Orban's Hungary or an Erdogan's Turkey. Because as bad as those situations are, certainly Orban is not also presiding over the occupation at 56 years of millions and millions of people who are denied the franchise, who were denied basic civil and human rights. So it's something worse than what we see in the quote unquote illiberal democracies around the world. And I think if you unpack for a moment the legal, if you look at the legal assault beyond the judicial assault, which I agree, of course, with Rachel, that a pause is a pause. One thing we've learned over the years is, let's take these folks at face. Let's believe what they say they are going to do. Let's believe them. So when Bibi says this is just a pause, and when the justice minister says, "Oh, we're going to come right back," let's assume that that is their plan. Doesn't mean they're going to succeed, but let's assume that that's their plan. But when we unpack that legal assault, what we see is that in addition to the judicial quote unquote reforms, right, the coup that has been in the news the last few weeks, there are several other elements. Those are not the only bad laws that are being pushed through the Knesset without a lot of fanfare, and frankly below the radar screen. A proud Jewish supremacist, the finance minister Bezalel Smotrich, who has declared himself a proud fascist and a proud homophobe. You can't make this up, folks. Was handed civilian control of aspects of the administration of Israel's occupation. So this is within the Israeli system, a totally legal process, which has made, as Michal Sfard, our dear friend and Israel's leading human rights lawyer, has said, annexation almost a de jure fact on the ground, as opposed to just a de facto one. So we have to pay attention to what's happening beneath the headlines. And of course, another piece of legislation that is being ginned up is one that would attempt to shut down the human rights organizations by imposing a a completely outrageous tax on funds that come from foundations that have relationships to foreign governments, such enemy foreign governments as, you know, the EU and the United Kingdom and Switzerland, and of course the United States, unless they make an exception. So it's very important for us to see that below the judicial coup are many other things, as Mickey said, brewing, that have to do with the character of the state, and we can't take our eye off the ball. When it comes to the things that give me hope and strength, you know, I was standing with Mickey and some of our other board members. You know, this was years ago, back 4 weeks ago. That's what it seems like with time. I was standing in Tel Aviv amongst these hundreds of thousands of people, and one of our fellow board members, who is a brilliant young professor and media personality, and she's a little bit, I'll call her, in case she's watching, she can be a little fatalistic, right? She's a hard-nosed realist. And she turned to me and Mickey and she said, well, turns out we're not Hungary and we're not Poland. And I think that it's very easy for you all, for us all who are not in Israel, to get the correct sense of the apocalyptic juncture at which Israel currently stands, right? We're not wrong. You're not wrong when you feel like Israel is at an existential crisis moment. And the fear of that is something that I think we understand. But what's harder to translate, and Rachel spoke to this, right, our former board chair, David Myers, called it the inspired outrage that you feel when you're in that crowd, right? Israelis are not going the way Hungary and Poland went. And it is a heady, heady thing to be in that group, in that crowd, and to see it. And, you know, Libby, this is the problem with you going forth, because I suspect you're going to want to say something like this too, and you'll say it brilliantly. But, you know, what we also saw when I was in Israel for the first time, the Israeli police, now under, you know, the control of Itamar Ben-Gvir, the minister for national security, for the first time turned their hoses on protesters in Tel Aviv, right? Like, not something that happens, where people like Rochelle and Mickey are fire hosed by the police. And groups of protesters, then in their thousands, began chanting at the police, "Where were you in Huwara?" Right, this is the Palestinian village that was rampaged through by 400 settlers after two settlers were shot dead in a terror attack a few days earlier. 400 settlers descended on this Palestinian village, murdered a resident, lit the place on fire, did what the chief of the civil administration, the IDF in the West Bank, called a pogrom. Right, the connection was made. And I don't want to be overly optimistic or Pollyannish, but the connection was made by a significant number of protesters, right, who were not Mickey and Rachel, who began to see that the assault on democracy in Israel was not something that could be separated from the attempt to make permanent and annex make permanent the occupation and really annex the West Bank without extending rights to people there. And that gave me hope.
Thanks, Daniel. And I'm really glad that you mentioned that, because I'm seeing the Q&A and people are chatting me privately with their questions. And there really are a lot of questions here, specifically about issues related to Palestinians, whether it's citizens or related to the occupation. And so I'm glad you raised it. I'm going to raise it also, and we're going to talk more about it because it's clearly one of the big things on people's minds. The only thing that I'll add to what the three of you said is just to showcase my own t-shirt, which is this t-shirt that says "No Democracy with Occupation," which I got from my friends in the Israeli protests in the anti-occupation bloc, which in the early days of this protest movement, the people that were showing up with that kind of message were feeling very marginal and marginalized and also pushed out. Some of them were met with aggression from other protesters, ripping flags down, things like that. And then after the moment that you discussed just now, Daniel, that you mentioned of the pogrom in Hawara, things changed for that anti-occupation bloc. I don't want to overstate it either, but the group that are protesting specifically with that message is growing and is met with less aggression from the rest of the protest. And that to me feels like an important thing. I tested the waters with it here in the United States, in Washington and New York, wearing this t-shirt as well, and was met only with welcoming sentiments. I see Gershon is here with an unacceptable backdrop. Unacceptable, the group of Israeli expats that have been organizing, sort of echo protests in cities around the United States and Europe that we've all been attending. To me, that's one of the big areas of hope. We've been talking for years about Israelis that live here, raising a voice and how important that voice could be. And now here we are. That's extremely visible. So that's just an addition, since we were showcasing t-shirts. And I will also say that Rachel and I could easily swap. She would easily be wearing this, and I would easily be wearing that, and our guys would easily wear either one as well. So yes, I'm getting lots of questions. Can we get the t-shirts? This is giving me a great idea. Janet, thank you. We should do a t-shirt shop on NIF's website. So we'll think about it.
It's a contribution to the protest.
Totally. I want to ask one more thing, and I'm going to bring in more questions. But we've been having lots of conversations on all sides of the oceans. And there's this thing that keeps coming up where people are saying, if you think this came out of nowhere, you haven't been paying attention. If you think that these extremists like Itamar Ben-Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich fell out of the sky and landed here today, then we've got something to tell you. And so I want to ask you, Daniel, to start, just like many of us have lived through the last couple of decades together, but some people are new. And also, we talk about a lot of different issues, but right now I want us to connect some of the dots about how did we get here? How did we get to this point? And what about it is an evolution, and what about it is a revolution? I'm using your own words at you. So go ahead, Daniel, and just help us understand how we got here.
Well, where we could really start is in early fall 1995, when I know that's not what you expected me to say. I'll quickly fast forward to when we come into the picture. When a band of right-wing militant thugs surrounded then Prime Minister Rabin's official car, and one of them tore the hood ornament off of the car, and he thrust it into the cameras, the news cameras that were there. And he said, we got to his car, next we'll get to him. Well, that person was Itamar Ben-Gvir, right? That is the national security minister of the state of Israel, the person to whom Netanyahu has just promised a personal militia of National Guards folks to serve. So this has been cooking for a very long time, and we're not here to talk about the history. There are plenty of good books out there that will talk about the history of how we got here. But in the more immediate sense, right, this militancy, this anti-democratic militancy, has been something that really has been growing in different ways since, late June 1967. Because after the Six-Day War, when Israel conquers, among other territories, the West Bank and the areas around East Jerusalem, right, this gives rise to a new movement in Israel. Let's call it, for our purposes, the settler movement, which has really, in many ways, taken over the driver's seat of the state of Israel in the decades between now and then. And so the Overton window, as we say, right, the discourse about what is normal in discourse has moved so far to the right in Israel over those decades that's been something that has been one of those shifts that happens slowly, so maybe people don't quite notice it. But in fact, this is not a radical change that happened when this government was elected in November. It is the unfortunate, in our opinion, right, trajectory that Israel has been on since 1967, with a massive assist with the assassination of Rabin, right, in 1995, and then the outbreak of the Second Intifada, which convinced so many Israelis that there was no hope for peace in the early 2000s. So by the time you get to the place where sort of NIF and many of us on this call really enter the story, it's 2010. And in 2010, again, as many of the folks on this Zoom know, we became the canary in the coal mine, one of the earliest indicators that the things that had begun in June 1967 were sort of coming to fruition, right? The bad seeds that were planted then were coming to fruition. And that's when NIF became targeted by what we call a gongo in the business. A gongo means a government organized NGO. In this case, an organization called Im Tirtzu. right? Which was an ultra right-wing organization. They're now some of the sponsors of the counter protests in Tel Aviv, which, as you have seen, have often turned violent and threatening. But when NIF and the human rights organizations that we support were initially targeted by some of these groups and then their allies in the Knesset, we at NIF sort of started to think something is going on that is different than the sort of, the tug of war that has gone on in Israel, that had gone on in Israel for many years about, for example, the disposition of the occupied territories, right? And when NIF and our organizations got targeted, I remember Rachel and I had literally just started working together, and this is a heartbreaker. But in the first meeting that we had, the first live meeting that the two of us had, just before these attacks on NIF commenced, right when we assumed these jobs in late 2009, Rachel wanted to talk to me about what NIF would do, how we would help ensure that an evacuation of the settlers from the West Bank would be carried out. What would the civil society role in making sure it was carried out better than the evacuation of the settlers from Gaza? So just imagine, that was not a ridiculous thing for the two of us to be talking about in the fall of 2009. And then in early 2010 came these attacks, and nothing has ever really been the same since then. But again, they didn't appear out of nowhere. They were the result of growth in the extreme populist anti-democratic right over many decades, and so when NIF was attacked by some of the same people who continue those attacks now, we were protected in those days by people who I consider McCain Likudniks, right? Likudniks of conscience. Again, it sounds funny to say it now, but people like the then Speaker of the Knesset, Ruby Rivlin, later the President, then Minister Dan Meridor, and Minister Benny Begin, the son of Menachem Begin, they met with Rachel and with me in person and said, even when we disagree with NIF, we will defend you to the end. Those people, without exception, are all gone from the right-wing leadership in political Israel today, much in the same way that most of those people are gone from the Republican Party in our own country today. And so we moved from a situation where that populist, anti-democratic right-wing, fueled by the settlement movement, et cetera, was married with real political power. And what happened in the last election was that, and I'll wrap up with this, Benjamin Netanyahu forgot the story of the golem, right? It's almost Passover, so we can tell ourselves Jewish folk stories. And in the story of the golem, right, as Easter and Pesach approach, the ghetto of Prague, a rabbi in Prague builds a mechanical man out of clay and to defend the Jewish people. But the thing about golems is they rampage. And they go off on their own. And Benjamin Netanyahu, looking at the election that he lost a year and a half ago because too many of the right-wing parties couldn't make the threshold, built a golem of Ben Gvir and Smotrich and put together a faction of his coalition which has no interest in playing by democratic rules and has no interest in the traditions of Israel and wants only to annex and only to rule. And they are now a golem, which he is incapable of controlling. And that's how we got to where we are now.
Thank you very much. In a nutshell, quite a nutshell that we've lived through. I'm going to start pulling in questions, and you'll be happy to know that there's real consistency. So I've gotten like 40 questions, but they're generally in a few overall categories. So I may not ask the question in exactly the words that you submitted it, because there's probably 15 other people that asked a similar question. The first one is what we've been referring to in our own circles as the elephant in the room. It's the elephant that my t-shirt keeps trying to bring into the room. And that's the real question about the occupation, predominantly the experience of Palestinians living in the West Bank, and the plans that, first of all, what is happening with regards to the West Bank towards the legalization of settlements and outposts. What are the measures that are threats in that area, but also what really has been the approach of the protests in Israel to talking about or not talking about the issues of occupation as it relates to democracy. Here we hear a lot of critique about that, about the exclusion of that message, which is also not new. We know that that was a message that was tried to be pushed out of the anti-corruption protests on Balfour Street outside of Netanyahu's residence, whenever that was, 2 years ago. In 2011, the social justice protests, same thing. It's my impression that the dynamic has been slightly different in this round of protests, this unprecedented round. But Mickey, can you share with us in this overall picture of how the occupation and Palestinians living under occupation, what's happening with that, and also what's happening in terms of talking about that in these opposition protests and other channels?
So yeah, that's I guess it's part of the most complicated questions when it comes to these protests, because I think that when it goes to the main stage or the discussion that is actually welcomed by the protest, I think there is a concept, or there is a notion that this talking about the occupation is quote unquote divisive. It tears apart the center left in Israel because there is a disagreement about it. Although I have to say that we hear more and more, not on the main stage, but in Yerushalayim or in Haifa or other places, people talking about it. I also feel that there is more of an understanding in the Hawara case that Daniel was mentioning did make a difference to people. People saw the connection between, the leadership of the settler movement as it being presented now by Smotrich and Ben Gvir, and what happened in Hawara and the emotional elements of it. And the last thing that I want to say about that, that we feel in way more space for our voice. I don't know if it's real and if it's sincere, but Dov Hanin, one of the former member of Knesset, speaking about the need of having a camp of tents, right? We're creating the camp, and each one of us, the women protest and the LGBT protest and the anti-occupation protest, and each one of us live in a tent, and our goal is to have a broad camp that can actually fit all these different tents. And I think that one of the things that has happened during this protest, that they've created a broad camp of tents, and the anti-occupation anti-occupation movement was able to get into the camp, and it's huge. Like, it sounds like a small thing, but it's huge. I heard something that I want to share with you, and I know that not all of my friends like it, but I think it's connected. I think that one of the reasons why people feel more comfortable with the anti-occupation voices within the camp is because the center was able, or the organizer of the protest were able to reclaim many of the Israeli symbols, like the flag. The moment there are so many flags, and there is less of a question about who we are, what do we stand for, what are our symbols, people feel more comfortable and more kind of like confident to allow even these voices. I want to say another thing which is really important. We always talk about the Balfour protest and so on. During the Balfour protest, there was a group of people that insisted to have a bloc, which is the anti-occupation bloc. I think that the movement of the anti-occupation movement has never seen a peak of activists going to the territories, working on behalf of Palestinian rights, acting with their own bodies against the occupations, as they seen after the Balfour protest. I think there is the fact that people are standing there and meeting people and talking to them and make the connection does grow the movement. I'm not sure that in the pace that I would want to see it. I'm not sure that everyone sees it. I do hear still people who feel very uncomfortable, including leadership of this protest with the anti-occupation voices. But this encounter and this very clear voice does grow the movement, and I think that our camp is growing, and there is more space for this tent. So therefore, if at some point people tell me, allow this voice to be outside of the camp, or that's not time. I actually think the opposite. I think that we are mature enough, strong enough, diverse enough in order to bring it forward. And to be honest, going back to my first remark, if any of you still remember, that's the issue, right? Their goal is one state, unequal state, apartheid state, with separate rights for Jews and Arabs, and that's the reason why they cannot afford a Supreme Court. That's the reason why they cannot afford a strong legal system. That's the reason why they can't afford human rights organizations. That's the reason why they can't afford diversity of reasons. So we can always tackle the symptoms, but if one wants to go to one, it's not the only one, but one of the main causes of the current reality, one cannot ignore the occupation. It just has to be there.
Thank you, Mickey, and Amen. I think many people on the call, including myself, will be very happy to hear you say that, and also very much agree. I've been asked to give a little bit of like geographic grounding in the names of places that we've just talked about. So the Balfour protests that Mickey was talking about and that I mentioned earlier, they were called the Balfour protests because Netanyahu's residence in Jerusalem was on Balfour Street, and the protests emerged out of that location in Jerusalem. And these Kaplan protests, which some people are referring to this latest round of protests as, Kaplan is a major thoroughway in Tel Aviv that connects like center city to the highway Ayalon, and the big explosion of protest activity started in Kaplan Street in Tel Aviv. This time around, both protest movements spread way beyond those locations, but when we sort of throw casually out those terms, that's what it's referring to. So there have been also a lot of questions. I'll just tell you the two other categories that I'm going to try to get to in the next 12 minutes. One is about Arab Israelis, Palestinian citizens of Israel, and their relationship both to this government, but also to these protests. What will the impact of judicial reform look like for these communities? And also, like, where are they and where aren't they right now in terms of opposition? I'm going to ask Rachel about that. Like on every NIF webinar, there's a lot of questions about what can we do from here and what are we doing from here. Daniel and I will also address that. And then there's a sprinkling of questions that are more specific about different aspects of the judicial coup. And I'm not sure that I'll get to all of those, but I will do my best. So Rachel, just there has been a lot of question, and I'm calling it question. It's kind of ranged from critique to invitation about Palestinian citizens of Israel, as you know, as we haven't seen massive participation of this 20% minority of Israeli citizenry in this moment. And so I want to ask you, like, to talk about any part of that picture that you would like to, that has to do with both the impact of this moment on Palestinian communities inside 1948 Israel, and also where are Arab voices in the protest movement and in the opposition right now? Why are they there? Why are they not there? What's the dilemma?
Okay, it's a big issue. It's a big issue because the Israeli Palestinians are 20% of the population in Israel, the biggest minority, and also everybody here, see them as our brothers and sisters in the democratic camp, as political partners, and the fact that they are not represented in the protest worries us a lot. So maybe I should divide it to two sections. First of all, the organizers, to be honest, completely honest, I feel amongst friends, the organizers at the beginning weren't too enthusiastic to have the Arabs because they were not still sure. It's exactly like Mickey explained about the Palestinians. It's better that it will be Jewish, patriotic, with flags and the Declaration of Independence and everything. I think as time went by, and the demonstration and the protest and everything became so much more successful, and hundreds of thousands, the organizers got more confidence, and they start inviting the Arabs to come and to speak on some of the places, like in Haifa and in other places. So in terms of the will of the organizers of this protest, there is a will now to have Israeli Arabs participate. Now, when you talk about the Arabs themselves, the Israeli Arabs themselves, there is a discussion among themselves. It's not one voice. You know, I can tell you that yesterday I was in an iftar dinner. Iftar is the, you know, the dinner of the Ramadan, the Muslim holiday, I should say, festive, in which they fast for 1 month. God forbid, I don't know how they do it, but that's another question. And every evening there is a dinner in which they host people. And yesterday I was there, and Ayman Odeh, the head of the Arab Joint List from previous election, was there. And he told me, I asked him what's going on, and he said to me, look, you know, some of the Arabs are very, very consistent in saying no. This is a legal reform. The Supreme Court was never too friendly to us, Arab minority in Israel, let alone the Palestinians in the occupied territories. We didn't feel that the Supreme Court in Israel really gave us protection. So it doesn't mean that it's there, and we support democracy, of course, we are not against, but to leave our house and go to protest, this is beyond what we can do. And others say, and he said that he belongs to this group, and he is trying to convince his friends, including the politician, that the group in Israel that will suffer the most if the right-wing coalition succeed will be the Israeli Arabs. And they just cannot afford not to be there, not to raise their voice, and not to be part in this game. And he said, I myself, I live in Haifa, and I go every week to all the demonstration, and more Arab are joining, but it's far from being enough. But of course, and this will be my last sentence, don't worry, Libby, everything that we talk about is always a symptom of something deeper in Israel. Nothing is simple in our reality. And of course, that it goes way back to, you know, our relation of Jews and Arabs in Israel from 48 and now on, the mistakes that we did and maybe they did, and our really vision, and this is where NIF comes into this, that to have a shared society in which Arabs will be equal parts of the society and will be included and will feel dignified. And this is something that is a priority for the New Israel Fund, now in the protest and for many years before, and to continue.
Thank you, Rachel. I'm going to bring in the diasporic and American centered questions, which spanned a gamut of things, but excuse me, but the main thing is really many of us are going to protests in our cities around the US and Canada and in Europe. And hello, Australians who are not here now, but will be watching. They've been protesting too. What kind of impact are we hoping, or are we seeing these protests in the United States and Canada and around the world having domestically and also back in Israel? And also there were a couple of questions about NIF at this moment, like how's our fundraising going? How's our recruitment going? Like, are we seeing new people? So Daniel, why don't you start us off with that, and I'll jump in if, you know, here and there maybe.
Sure. Well, look, first of all, you know, one of the questions that a lot of people asked before even we were sort of protesting in America was what effect are the protests really having over there? I think that is pretty manifest now. We can see what effect they had on Netanyahu and his decision to pause the protest. But I think what is maybe less evident is what I heard from the folks with whom I speak in the State Department and at the White House and in Congress, which was that the protests in Israel gave cover for the Biden administration and for Democrats in Congress to take the positions that they've been taking. I think it's important that we hear that loud and clear, and that you all in Israel hear that. It's not exactly what Libby asked, but I think it's an important point to be made, that the enormous showing by Israelis in protest to what was happening, gave cover to the administration in the United States and other friends of Israel abroad in Europe and elsewhere in Canada to be able to also make more critical statements that they might have otherwise done. In terms of what we can do here and the effectiveness of it here, well, how many of you heard the president on, what was it, just less than a week ago when he spoke at the tarmac, when he was asked point blank about whether he was going to invite Netanyahu to the White House, and he said no, not in the foreseeable future. And one of the things he said was what Israel was doing was contrary to the wishes of many Israelis, by all accounts from recent polling, a majority of Israelis, and of democratic countries everywhere. But he also said, and the American Jewish community. So our administration is paying careful attention to what we, the American Jewish community, are saying and doing when we get out there and protest, and when we support the folks in Israel. And then in turn, I don't know if you all noticed, but there was an immediate backlash from the Netanyahu circles against Biden and Ben Gvir and others, who then sort of attacked the administration. And in response, the protesters on Saturday night at the big protest this week actually had an enormous American flag and signs that said, protect us, Biden. So it's a fascinating ecosystem where these things are not disconnected and folks are paying attention to what's happening on all sides, including what we do in the American Jewish community. Now, like speaking parochially from the NIF perspective, we did what I believe we must do and what I think you all expect us to do at moments like this, which is that we looked at the landscape at the beginning of this crisis and asked ourselves, what is not there that we have the unique core competency to bring online? And the first thing that we did was that we tripled our emergency grants program. And Mickey and I and Rachel were speaking just earlier today about the rate at which we are burning through these grants, but we have been able to do everything from funding the initial protests, right, which were the first mass protests organized by our grantees with emergency support from NIF, to now working to ensure that more peripheral communities, Palestinian citizens of Israel, LGBTQ folks in the physical periphery of the country are also represented, as well as a host of other things in response to this crisis. We can do that because NIF supporters have been supporting this emergency campaign to dramatically increase our grant response. And also, we're building something that I think is unique in Israel. We learned it from models in South Africa and Brazil and other places where civil society is challenged and threatened by authoritarian and wannabe autocrats. And we call it the hub. And the idea of the hub is that NIF has created a clearinghouse for everything that is happening that challenges both the legal system of Israel and civil society in Israel. So this small team that is created and funded by NIF keeps track of the bad laws, the bad policies, but also the attacks on civil society actors and on activists from various places. And then it connects those organizations and those activists to resources, legal representation, crisis communications, cybersecurity, and we fund it and we make sure that no one is left alone and targeted by the hard right wing in Israel. So those are things that we're doing that you all are helping us do. So by showing up at the protests, by making sure that you let our elected officials on this side of the ocean know where you stand and our friends in Israel, and by supporting efforts like NIF's emergency response, we're actually, I think, making a significant contribution to what's happening.
Thank you very much, Daniel. And we're going to put a link to our Passover fundraising emergency campaign in the chat for anyone who's looking for how to contribute. I know that we're at the hour, but I am going to give us each a chance for a very brief closing remark. And I wanted to touch on another area of questions that came in while we were talking, which really does have to do with how we imagine, in our best case scenario, channeling this resistance energy into political power in the longer term. So like what, just not a whole, that's a big question for a closing remark, but just something that is, that we see here as an opportunity. So there were questions about what does it look like for the government to compromise on this? Could there be positive changes to the courts? What about the Haredim? What about the education system? What are kids learning in school? There's a lot of questions that have to do with that, as well as questions about recent polls that have come out showing that maybe now Israelis are 2/3 against these measures, or maybe the coalition would look a very different way if there were elections called in the short term. I will start and say that one of the things that has been really inspiring and exciting to see is some new ideational work from marginalized communities, actually presenting a vision for democracy and equality for the future. I'm thinking about a new group called the Mizrahi Civic Democracy Group, or Democracy Civic Group, which is really developing visionary ideas about a more equal future and how to get there. And I think we're going to see more and more of that as an outgrowth of this moment of opposition. That's the part that I'm excited about. We have not really had that in the progressive movement for a long time, though NIF has tried to bring that infrastructure in. I think this is a moment where it can happen much more organically. When Rachel said the quote from the Israeli actress that said, "The lover left and this, we don't want to go back." So what does it even mean to go forward? And having some of that intellectual thought leadership done now feels extremely important to me. I'm going to ask Daniel to go next, then Mickey, and we'll end with Rachel.
Well, look, very quickly, I think one, Libby and her team have been inviting people to join us. That is to say, people who previously in America and beyond, who would not have considered supporting NIF their first response, have been coming to NIF over these last months because we offer them sort of a way to engage while acknowledging what's actually going on in Israel. And that's been very heartening to me. And what I want to say to all of you, and what I want us to keep our eye on the ball here, it's sort of the actress again that Rachel quoted. Look, at NIF, we are not fighting for Israel to go back to the way it was when Naftali Bennett was the prime minister of Israel 4 months ago. We are not, or 5 months ago. We are not, that is not NIF's goal, is to get Israel back to a status quo where we can ignore the the de facto second-class citizenship of Palestinian citizens of Israel, where we can ignore 56 years of an occupation denying rights to Palestinians. Like, we are working now to take advantage of this moment of crisis to widen the horizon and move that Overton window in a direction that will actually be able to confront some of the crises that are behind, that are the fuel, the engine of what's happening now in Israel.
Thanks, Daniel.
So yeah, I think that in many ways, I really hope that we are creating this broader camp that allows different tents to live and work together. I think that the desire of our environment not only to be right and not only to be saying the right things, but actually to acquire power and influence should become something very important. The moment we give up on the notion of power and influence and want only to be about the right words or right thinkings, we get to a point in which we have the most extreme right-wing government in place. And I think there is a bigger opportunity than ever today. The people around us understand the importance of future thinking, compromise, and living together, although not agreeing on everything, but politically, I mean, and that's the moment in which we are today.
Thanks, Mickey. How about you, Rachel?
Even though I hate the cliche, which is true that in every crisis there is an opportunity, I can't ignore the enormous opportunity for our camp now. And I can say our camp. I mean, before I couldn't say these two words together. And we need to give a lot of thinking about how to convert this energy to political power that can really, come up with concrete achievements. And I think the kind of course of action that New Israel Fund started already years ago with our strategic planning, in which we think how we strengthen the liberal democratic camp in Israel. We give them the tools, we give them the think tanks, the campaign, we help them create leadership. all of that we should continue doing and strengthen our camp, so there will be camp and the opportunity will knock on the door and we will be able to win. And I wanted maybe to conclude by saying that some of the authors in Israel wrote something which I found very moving to me. She said that this what's going on, this protest, this demonstration, whatever you call it, is kind of making every one of us look back at what is his real connection, what makes him connect to this country, to this land of Israel, what makes us love it, how we are connected, what's the imprint, what's the love story that we have? Is it because our parents, my parents came from the Holocaust and saw Israel as a miracle and I took that, and or is it because, you know, we want our children to grow in a liberal? What is easily, and to remake the choice to be here, to stay here, to fight for what's going on. And Pesach as the Chag HaCherut, the freedom, the holiday that talks about freedom, is just so symbolic that it's coming now. It's really the time for us to think of how we are going to be free, democratic, fighting for justice, equality, and peace. And Chag Sameach. Happy Passover to all of you. And thank you for your support and your love. We really, really need it.